What would you do if your own child looked you in the eye, sitting in your late wife's chair, and told you, "This house isn't yours anymore"? I didn't argue. I just smiled, walked away, and made a promise. They will never forget this day. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The evening light lay gold on Clearview Lake when Roy Hayes eased his truck beside the gravel and lifted a small overnight bag from the seat. He paused at the foot of the porch steps, breathing in cedar and water, ready for the quiet that used to keep him steady. The quiet wasn't there. Ethan was in Roy's chair, one ankle thrown over his knee as if posing for a photograph. Madison sat close, a glass tilting between careful fingers. Her parents, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, had the look of people who'd already moved in behind their smiles. Roy put the bag down and met his son's eyes. No raised voice, no question. Just that millimeter of stillness that used to make Ethan fix his tone when he was younger. "You're not allowed here anymore," Ethan said without hesitation. "This is their house now." Madison touched his sleeve, a rehearsed gesture. Patricia gave a pale, satisfied smile and set her glass, not on a coaster, but directly on the arm of the chair Roy had sanded last month. Gerald nodded, polite, proprietary, final. Roy's mouth curved into a slow, contained smile. On the inside, a sentence landed with the weight of a blueprint. "They will never forget this day." He lifted the bag again, stepped back down, and crossed the drive. Gravel spoke under his boots. The water kept breathing. In the cab, he took one breath, then another, and turned the key. The engine caught clean. He checked the mirror once. Ethan had already turned away, laughing at something Madison said, the picture of a man confident the deed was done. Roy backed onto the lane and let the pines fold the road into a long green tunnel. The sting faded into something colder, truer. He had spent 30 years building structures that stood through wind and seasons. Houses did not argue. They obeyed plans. So would this. He saw the next steps assembling themselves with the calm of a foreman. Document, defend, deter, own the timing, control the information, leave no loose boards for anyone to pry. By the time the highway opened in front of him, the decision was set like curing concrete. The bag on the passenger seat slid as he accelerated. The quiet returned, not as comfort, but as resolve. He headed for Phoenix with the first line written in his mind: "Start the build." Roy drove through the pines with the radio off, the rhythm of the tires carrying him into memory. The villa had never been just another property. It was where he and Helen had built something that lived beyond concrete and nails. Every summer, after the place was finished, she insisted they add a small tradition, something that made the lake house different from the house in Phoenix. The first year, it was morning coffee on the porch swing, no matter the weather. The second year, it was keeping a logbook in the kitchen drawer, where guests would write a note about their visit. By the third summer, she had sewn a quilt from scraps of fabric gathered over decades of family life, and it took its permanent place on the back of the couch. Roy could still see her fingers moving with quick certainty as she stitched, each piece carrying its own history. Ethan's old soccer jersey, the hem of a dress Helen wore on their 20th anniversary, scraps of curtains from their first apartment. That quilt had weight beyond warmth. It was a record. The cedar coasters were his contribution. One summer, he had cut planks in the workshop, sanded the edges, and burned a simple pattern into each with a heated nail. Helen teased him about their rough look, but she used them religiously, laughing whenever someone forgot. The porch swing was hers and his together, built one afternoon from a kit, but strengthened with his adjustments so it would hold forever. They had painted it white, and every season it needed touching up. Helen never minded. She said imperfection made it feel alive. All of those objects were still there when he stepped onto the porch that evening. He had seen Patricia's glass sweating directly onto the cedar table, leaving a ring that would stain. The quilt lay on the couch inside, draped neatly but without recognition. To Madison, it was decoration. To Helen, it had been an archive. Even the swing carried new weight now, not from love, but from trespass. The place that had been carved out of years of shared work had been turned into a stage for entitlement. It was not just an intrusion into property. It was an intrusion into grief itself. For 3 years since Helen passed, Roy had driven the 2 hours to Clearview when he needed to breathe differently. Sometimes he stayed overnight, sometimes just long enough to mend a railing or oil a hinge. Work was his way of remembering her, the way he kept her presence alive. Each task was a conversation. Every nail he tapped was an answer to the silence she had left behind. To be told that the place was empty, that it belonged to someone else now, was to hear that her memory was disposable. It was not about wood or land. It was about a bond. That was why the words Ethan spoke cut deeper than if they had been shouted. Calm, steady, and absolute, they carried the arrogance of someone who thought ownership was measured by use. Roy knew better. Ownership was measured by memory, by sweat, by the rituals of ordinary days. That lake house was Helen's laughter echoing over the water, the scrape of her chair on the porch, the warmth of her hand as the sun went down. When Ethan claimed it for strangers, he was not just seizing a building. He was trying to erase the space where Roy kept his wife close. That was the true betrayal, and it demanded an answer as deliberate as the love that had built it. The phone rang just after 6, the kind of ring that split the evening silence in two. Roy picked it up without hurry, his thumb resting on the worn edge of the receiver. Ethan's voice came through, clipped, practiced, the way men speak when they've already decided the outcome. "Dad, Madison and I talked it over. The villa's going to be theirs permanently. Gerald and Patricia are moving in." Roy let the words settle. He'd expected a bluff, maybe a long weekend, but permanent? That was the anchor Ethan was trying to drive into the ground. "Come again," Roy said evenly. "You heard me. It makes sense. They need it. You hardly go up there. It just sits empty." Empty. Roy's jaw tightened. He thought of sanding the porch railing, of tightening the swing's chains, of touching the quilt when the house felt too still. Empty wasn't the word, sacred was. Ethan's tone hardened. "You're older now, alone. What do you need with all that space? It's unhealthy, clinging to it." That was the script. Gaslight the father, reframe memory as selfishness, twist loss into weakness. Roy's reply cut clean through. "You can't give what you don't own." The line went silent. For years he'd bent, compromised, explained. Tonight, he didn't explain. Ethan finally exhaled, sharp with frustration. "You think you can stop this? Don't embarrass yourself." Roy didn't raise his voice. He didn't bargain. He didn't even announce his decision. He just shifted the phone in his hand, pressed the red button, and ended the call first. For the first time in his life as Ethan's father, he was the one to hang up. The click was small, but it echoed through the house like a gavel. He stood for a long moment in the still kitchen, staring at the dark window. Helen's reflection wasn't there, only his own, steadier now than it had been in years. Ending the call hadn't been dismissal, it had been boundary. And boundaries, he knew, were the first beams in any structure worth standing. The silence afterward didn't feel hollow. It felt like a foundation curing, preparing for the weight that would be built upon it. Roy sat in the study, the phone still silent after he had ended the last call, and the shape of his next move began to settle. In construction, no project ever stood on vague hopes. You laid out phases, broke the work into sections, and marked deadlines. You didn't call them options, because options implied choice. He called them advantages. The word alone shifted the ground. This wasn't desperation. This was leverage. He took a pad of paper and wrote in block letters across the top, "Advantages." Under it, the rules came back the way they always did when negotiations turned hostile. Rule 1. Never negotiate desperate. Rule 2. Control the information. Rule 3. Own. The timing. Those 3 rails had carried him through decades of work, zoning boards, contractors who lied about costs, clients who tried to back out of deals. Now they would carry him through his son's betrayal. The first phase was obvious, legal. Marcus Lee had been his attorney for 20 years, a man who could shore up a foundation of paper as solidly as Roy could pour concrete. By tomorrow, Marcus would have every deed, every tax receipt, every insurance document on his desk. Roy wanted the legal walls braced tight before Ethan or Madison even thought about lawyers. The second phase would not be in court, it would be in the mind. Darren Miles lived 3 doors down, a wiry man with smudged glasses and a home that looked like a server rack. Darren was a tinkerer, the kind who turned curiosity into systems that unnerved burglars and pranksters alike. Roy had once helped him with a burst pipe, refusing payment, and Darren had never forgotten. If anyone could lace the villa with deterrents, motion sensors, sound, light, whispers that made skin crawl, it was Darren. That wasn't violence. That was defense, staged the way an architect stages light through a skylight. Intentional, invisible, until needed. Roy leaned back in the chair, eyes on Helen's photograph. The rules would hold. No shouting matches, no pleading calls, no second guessing. Legal first, then psychology. Timing last. Ethan had given him a date, next weekend. That was the deadline, and Roy had built his life on deadlines. He drew a line under the notes, pressed the pen flat against the page, and felt the plan lock into place. The structure was rising already, beam by beam, in his mind. The following afternoon, Roy walked into Marcus Lee's downtown office with a folder tucked under his arm. The leather chairs and heavy blinds hadn't changed in 20 years, and neither had Marcus. The lawyer rose from behind his oak desk, hand extended, his manner calm as always. "Roy," Marcus said, "it's been too long." "What's the situation?" Roy set the folder down with deliberate care. "Clearview Villa. My son has decided it belongs to his wife's parents. He told me, to my face, that I wasn't welcome there anymore. Yesterday he called to make it permanent." Marcus's brows shifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He pulled a yellow pad closer, pen poised. "Do you have the title deed in your name?" Roy slid the top document forward. "Outright purchase?" 12 years ago. Paid in full. Taxes current." Marcus examined the deed, then nodded once. "Good. That makes this straightforward on paper. But family property fights rarely stay on paper. They'll try to make it emotional, or they'll escalate into noise. The only thing that survives is the record." Roy leaned back, arms folded. "Then we make a record." "Exactly," Marcus said. "From this moment on, every call, every text, every voicemail. Document it. Date, time, verbatim words, screenshot. The texts. Preserve the voicemails. If they show up at your home or the villa, write down the details. Paper trails turn shouting into evidence. Property fights inside families end in paperwork, not shouting." Roy's mouth tightened in something close to a smile. "Then, let's start the paperwork." Marcus laid out the plan, each step as crisp as if he were drafting blueprints. First, a recorded letter to Ethan, not accusatory but factual, confirming Roy's sole ownership and his expectation of peaceable respect. Second, a notice of no trespass, prepared but held in reserve. Third, preparatory filings to reinforce the deed. If necessary, Roy could place the villa in a trust or record a donor clause that would make outside claims meaningless. "You don't have to move fast emotionally," Marcus said, "but we need to move fast procedurally." If they intend to occupy the property, we want the sheriff's office clear on the facts before they put a foot across the threshold. Roy nodded. Ethan gave me a date. This weekend. Then we'll beat it, Marcus replied, jotting notes. Tomorrow morning we'll courier the recorded letter. By Friday, I'll have the notice prepped. If they so much as try to enter, law enforcement will know where you stand. Roy sat still for a moment, then said, For 3 years, I've kept quiet, kept peace by writing checks and swallowing pride. That ends here. This isn't a quarrel anymore. It's a structure, and we're going to build it. Solid, Marcus met his eyes. Then we start pouring concrete right now. The two men bent over the desk, paper against wood, turning betrayal into documentation, silence into testimony, and grief into a fortress that Ethan could not breach without leaving fingerprints. The first beams of the perimeter were rising, not in stone or steel, but in signatures, dates, and the black ink of certainty. Roy knocked on Darren Miles's door just after 8 in the morning. The man answered in a faded t-shirt, glasses perched low on his nose, the glow of computer monitors painting his living room. Darren blinked once, then smiled faintly. Richard, he said, I figured you'd come sooner or later. What's the project? Roy stepped inside. Not a project. A defense. I need the villa fitted so no one walks in and feels comfortable. Not to harm, just to deter, unsettle, and if necessary, record. That was all Darren needed. He set down his coffee, pulled a notepad from the counter, and started sketching. Motion sensors in every main room, he explained, could trigger light patterns, soundscapes, even appliances. Directional audio modules could whisper a phrase directly into one ear while the rest of the room stayed silent. Compact projectors could cast tall shifting silhouettes across walls and ceilings. Faucets could roar open in sequence, a house suddenly breathing water. Timed smart locks could add a delay, 30 seconds that felt like a lifetime. When panic set in, and all of it could run off hidden batteries tied to a closed network, immune to a breaker flip or a Wi-Fi password change. Roy listened without blinking. Not tricks. A system, he said. Something with a nervous system. By noon, Darren's SUV was loaded with sensors the size of smoke alarms, spools of LED strips, 3 projectors, a tablet preloaded with control software, and 2 slim battery packs. They drove to the villa in silence, the pines parting as the lake came into view. Roy unlocked the door, inhaled the faint scent of cedar polish, and stepped aside. It's yours, he said. Darren moved quickly, mounting the first motion detector above the entryway, syncing it to the tablet. He demonstrated, step across the threshold, and the living room lights strobed red and white, sharp enough to disorient, but not blind. A calm, synthesized voice followed. Attention. You are not the owner of this property. Leave immediately. They climbed the stairs. Darren tucked a projector high into the landing corner. When activated, a lank silhouette swayed across the hall like someone pacing. Even Roy, knowing it was an illusion, felt his pulse shift. Downstairs, speakers whispered irregular creaks and footsteps, set on a loop too subtle to trace. In the kitchen, Darren connected the smart valves. 30 seconds of motion triggered a rush of water from sink and shower both. By late afternoon, they ran the full sequence. Lights pulsed, shadows flickered, whispers pressed against the ear, water roared, and locks delayed just long enough to feel like walls closing in. Then silence fell, the house still again, waiting. Roy stood in the middle of the living room, listening to his own heartbeat. It's not violence, Darren said. It's theater. They'll leave because the house itself tells them they don't belong. Roy nodded once. Good. That's all I need. Teeth, not to bite, but to remind them what's mine. The villa was no longer just wood and stone. It was a body now, a nervous system primed to defend, a memory of Helen wrapped in circuitry and resolve. The message came on a Thursday evening, crisp and curt as if it were business rather than blood. Ethan's text lit up Roy's phone while he sat at the study desk in Phoenix. "We'll be at the lake house Saturday, 2 p.m. Don't come up. No greeting, no attempt at civility. Just a claim written like a decree." Roy read it twice, then set the phone face down beside the control tablet that already glowed with the villa's camera feeds. Exact timing. It was all he needed. Friday passed in preparation, though he had little left to do. Marcus had the paperwork in motion, Darren's system was fully armed, and the villa itself had become something more than four walls. Roy checked each feed at intervals. Entryway, living room, upstairs landing, kitchen. All still, all waiting. On the porch, Darren had mounted a brushed steel plate. "Smart home in Aiken. Testing. Enter at your own risk." The words were part cover, part warning, though Roy doubted it would slow anyone down. Saturday noon, he brewed black coffee and sat in his leather chair, the tablet angled just right. The lake on the entryway camera glimmered under a thin veil of sunlight. By 2:02, a silver SUV nosed into the gravel drive, dust curling behind its tires. Ethan climbed out first, his posture sharp with entitlement. Madison followed, sunglasses perched in her hair, giving quick directions as Gerald and Patricia hauled bags from the back. They looked like travelers arriving at a vacation rental, not intruders at a man's home. Patricia noticed the sign first. She froze, one hand tight on her tote, lips pressed thin. Gerald bent to read it aloud, voice dipped in disdain. "Enter at your own risk. Smart home testing." His chuckle carried false confidence. Madison brushed past. "Ignore it. Dad's being dramatic." Ethan didn't even glance, but Patricia wasn't satisfied. She yanked the plate free, screws squealing, metal clattering onto the porch. "First thing to go," she said, nudging it aside with her shoe, her smile smug. Roy leaned back in Phoenix, watching the feed. His fingers tapped once on the armrest. The sequence had not begun yet. The villa was quiet, polite, even welcoming. But now, with their ETA confirmed and their arrogance on full display, the countdown had truly started. The clock had struck 2, and the house was ready to answer them in its own voice. The house at Clearview Lake had never looked more like itself. From the outside, it was the same warm cedar porch, the same tall windows, the same quilt Helen had once folded over the couch. But Roy knew that by 10:03 p.m., it would stop being familiar and start becoming something else, a system alive with teeth. He sat in Phoenix, the tablet in front of him, feeds from every corner of the villa displayed in neat squares. Entryway, kitchen, upstairs landing, guest rooms. Each camera pulsed a soft green, armed, ready. He waited, the same way a builder waits for concrete to set, steady, patient, watching the clock. At 10:03 sharp, Roy pressed the command. The villa answered in less than a breath. First, the lights, sharp strobing bursts in red, blue, and white, disorienting and relentless. The living room looked like a storm of color, shadows jerking across walls. Upstairs, the landing projector cast a tall silhouette, pacing slowly, endlessly. From the directional audio above the entryway, a low whisper curled, "You shouldn't be here." The kitchen faucets exploded with water, gushing with mechanical force, stainless steel hissing under the surge. Showers upstairs roared alive, steam rising into the hallway. Gerald stumbled back, shielding his eyes, while Madison screamed at Ethan, "Turn it off!" "What did you do?" Patricia's shriek cut through every other sound, high and raw, as she saw the silhouette move across the landing wall. Ethan rushed for the front door, but the smart lock held firm, a 30-second delay designed to feel like entrapment. He yanked at the handle, his jaw set tight, but the lock remained dead. Madison clawed at her phone, hands shaking. Gerald grabbed Patricia's arm and shouted, "We're leaving, now!" When the lock finally clicked, the four of them spilled onto the porch, blinking, panicked, clutching each other as though the house itself might chase them. They tumbled into the SUV, gravel spraying as they reversed out. At 2:14 a.m., the police entered. The feeds showed calm faces, flashlights sweeping quiet rooms. Their report the next day, a faulty smart system, nothing criminal. But Roy knew better. The villa had spoken in a voice only his family could understand. The call came just after dawn. Roy had been sitting at his kitchen table in Phoenix, coffee cooling in his hand, the tablet still showing the villa feeds frozen on an empty porch. The phone buzzed sharp against the wood, Ethan's name lighting the screen. Roy let it ring twice, then answered. "What did you do?" Ethan's voice was tight, brittle, like he hadn't slept. Roy leaned back in his chair, voice calm. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb. Last night, the house went insane. Lights flashing, water pouring everywhere, voices in the walls. Madison's parents are shaken to the core. Patricia swears she saw someone upstairs. What kind of sick joke was that?" Roy's silence stretched just long enough to make his point. Then, "Ethan, I was 200 miles away. Right here, in Phoenix. You know it." Ethan's breath crackled down the line. "You hired someone." "Don't tell me you didn't." "Son," Roy said evenly, "do you hear yourself? Who exactly would I hire to turn your midnight wine party into a haunted circus? Think about it." The silence that followed was sharper than shouting. Finally, Ethan hissed, "This isn't over." The line went dead. By mid-morning, the villa's entryway feed showed a gray sedan pulling into the driveway. A man got out carrying a heavy black toolbox. Roy recognized the type, locksmith. Ethan hovered beside him, gesturing at the front door with a mix of frustration and urgency. The mic picked up the exchange clearly. "These locks aren't standard," the locksmith said after a long inspection. "They're tied into an integrated system, biometric, wireless, maybe even layered with backup power. Not something I can pop open with a pick. Can you replace them?" Ethan pressed. "Not without reprogramming the entire network. That's not my line of work. You need a tech specialist, someone who deals with smart systems at the root." He snapped his toolbox shut. "Otherwise, you'll just make it worse." Ethan's jaw tightened as the locksmith drove away, gravel crunching under his tires. The villa feed caught Ethan standing alone on the porch for a long moment, hands on his hips, before storming back to his SUV. Roy allowed himself a small, private smile. The only man within 200 miles who could truly navigate that system was Darren Miles, and Darren wouldn't lift a finger without Roy's word. Later that afternoon, another call came. Ethan again, angrier, voice pitched higher. "This won't stop us. If it's a tech issue, we'll get someone. If it's you, we'll prove it." Roy kept his tone neutral. "Then prove it." Until then, the house seems to be doing exactly what it's meant to do, keeping out intruders. "You think you're clever?" Ethan spat. Roy's reply was steady as stone. "No, I think I'm prepared." The call ended there. Roy sat back, watching the feeds on his tablet. The villa stood quiet under the late afternoon light, serene as if nothing had ever happened. But he knew the message had landed. His son had thrown money at a locksmith, tried bluster over the phone, threatened with the promise of outside help. None of it mattered. The house had become a fortress, not of walls, but of design. And design was Roy's trade. For the first time in years, he didn't feel cornered. He felt steady. Ethan might rage, Madison might smirk, Patricia might sneer, and Gerald might nod his oily nod. But every move they made only confirmed what Roy already knew. They were on his ground now, and he was the only one who understood the terrain. The knock came just after sunset, 3 sharp raps that carried more demand than request. Roy had been expecting it. He set down the book he hadn't been reading and walked to the door without hurry. When he opened it, Ethan stood in the frame, jaw tight. Madison, a step behind him with arms folded like a shield. "We need to talk," Ethan said, voice clipped. Roy stepped aside, motioning them in. "By all means." They crossed the threshold like they owned even this space. Madison's perfume hit the air first, citrusy, sharp, rehearsed. She didn't sit. She hovered near Ethan, chin lifted. "This ends now," Ethan began. "Whatever you're doing, whatever tricks you've set up at the lake house, it stops tonight. Either you hand it over or—" He glanced at Madison. She took the line without hesitation. "Or you lose us forever. No visits, no holidays, no future grandchildren. We'll cut you out completely." Her words landed in the living room like a blade meant to sever, but Roy didn't flinch. He let the silence hang, studying them both as though they were presenting figures in a negotiation. "So that's the offer," he said finally. "The house in exchange for family." Madison crossed her arms tighter. "It's not an offer. It's reality. You're old, Roy. Alone. What do you need with a lakeside villa? We could make it a home. My parents need it. Ethan deserves it. You clinging to it is selfish." Roy's eyes stayed steady. "Selfish," he repeated, almost tasting the word. "Do you know what selfishness is, Madison? It's deciding that what belongs to another man is yours because you want it." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but Ethan stepped in. "We're not trying to hurt you, Dad. We're trying to make this work for everyone. You hardly go there. It just sits empty. You're stuck in the past, and it's unhealthy." Roy tilted his head, weighing the words the way he would weigh lumber before cutting. "You can't give what you don't own," he said, "and you can't shame me out of what's mine." Ethan's voice rose. "Don't you see? You're forcing us into this position. You've been difficult ever since Mom died. Madison and I have carried you more than you realize." That broke through Roy's composure for the first time. Not with anger, but with the faintest smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You carried me? Was it when I paid off your loans? Or the down payment on your condo? Or when I bought your SUV because Madison needed something reliable? You've carried me very lightly, Ethan. My wallet did most of the lifting." The words left Ethan flushed. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the argument half-formed and already unraveling. Madison leaned forward, seizing the silence. "If you don't hand over the keys, we'll sue you. Harassment, emotional distress, whatever it takes. And when people ask why we had to go this far, we'll tell them about the lake house going crazy, the lights, the voices. We'll tell them you lost your grip." Roy straightened. His voice was level, unhurried. "You call it harassment. The police call it a faulty smart system. Nothing illegal, nothing provable. That story won't get you far." Madison's composure cracked for the first time. "So you're really choosing a house over your son?" "No," Roy said, steady as poured concrete. "I'm choosing to keep what's mine. If you decide that means you walk away, that's your choice. I won't stop you, but don't pretend it was my hand on that knife." Ethan exhaled hard through his nose, almost a growl. "You think you've won something here? You haven't. You're just an old man hiding behind walls. We'll find a way around them." Roy's voice cut clean. "Then try. But remember this. Family survives with boundaries. It dies without them. I am keeping what's mine." The room held the echo of the words. No anger, no volume, just a statement as immovable as stone. Madison turned sharply toward the door. "We're done here." Ethan lingered a moment longer, eyes locked on his father's, searching for the man who used to bend, the man who used to say yes. But that man was gone, and what stood before him now was immovable. He followed Madison out without another word. The door closed behind them with a muted thud. Roy leaned against it for a moment, not from weakness, but from recognition. They thought they had delivered a dagger. All they had handed him was data, and data could be used to build. The morning. After Ethan and Madison's ultimatum, Roy Hayes drove downtown with the calm of a man who had already made up his mind. Phoenix's early sun was bright and clean, spilling over glass towers, but he barely noticed it. The words from his son still lingered in the back of his mind. Give it up, or lose us forever. But instead of cutting deep, they had clarified the path. If family could be wielded like a weapon, then the lake house needed to be placed somewhere no hand could reach. Marcus Lee's office was a place Roy knew well. For decades, the attorney had been the voice of precision and protection, whether in contract disputes or city negotiations. Today, though, it wasn't about business. It was about legacy. Marcus stood when Roy walked in, his handshake firm, his eyes curious. "You said this was urgent," Marcus began. "It is," Roy said. "I need to make sure the lake house is out of Ethan's reach." Permanently, Marcus leaned back, adjusting his glasses. "You're talking about a transfer." "I'm talking about more than that," Roy replied. "I want it beyond argument, beyond loopholes, beyond intimidation. It can't remain a battlefield." For a long moment, Marcus studied him, then nodded slowly. "All right. That leaves a handful of options: sale, irrevocable trust, or charitable donation. Selling would cut ties, but it puts the property on the market. Your son could try to interfere. A trust would protect ownership, but family litigation can still chip at the edges if someone wants to make it ugly. Donation, though, that's clean, public, recorded, unshakable." Roy folded his hands. "Donation? To the right place." "Do you have one in mind?" Marcus asked. "Yes." Roy's voice softened as he spoke. "Helen used to volunteer at the Veterans Rest Initiative. She believed in it, gave weekends to it, raised money for their programs. They've been trying to secure property near the lake for years. If the villa became theirs, it would honor her. It would heal others, instead of tearing me apart." Marcus's pen stilled above his pad. "That would work. They're mission-aligned, legitimate, and local. Once we record the deed in their name, the house won't be yours, which means it won't be Ethan's either. Legally, he won't have a thread to pull." Roy nodded. "Then let's do it." Marcus hesitated. "You understand what you're giving up? Once it's transferred, it's theirs. You can't revoke it if you change your mind." Roy's eyes were steady. "Then we'll add something. A clause. Lifetime donor access. Honorary. I still want to sit on that porch, look at that water, visit the place where Helen's memory breathes. But I don't want it on my shoulders anymore. I want it beyond contest." Marcus's lips curved slightly at the clarity. "That's possible. A donor access clause, revocable only by you. You'll never technically own it again, but you'll always have the right to enter, to stay, to use it when it's available. It will be recorded, binding, and visible to anyone who checks the deed." Roy exhaled. For the first time in months, the tension in his chest loosened. "Good. Draft it." By afternoon, they were sitting at a polished table with neat stacks of paper spread between them. The documents carried the weight of finality: the gift deed, the charitable conveyance agreement, the clause for lifetime access. Each page carried precise language that closed every possible door Ethan might try to open. Marcus slid the top page toward him. "Here is the deed transfer. Once signed and recorded with the county clerk, Veterans Rest Initiative will be the legal owner. Here is the donor access clause, honorary, irrevocable, except by your own written request. And here is the compliance affidavit for charitable intent." Roy read every line. The language was cold, technical, but beneath it ran a current of something warmer. This wasn't just paperwork. It was protection, resolution, transformation. The lake house that had been turned into a point of humiliation would become a sanctuary for others who knew battle in far harsher forms. Helen would have approved. She would have insisted. He signed. Each stroke of the pen felt like a stone lifted off his shoulders and set on firmer ground. When he finished, Marcus gathered the documents, aligning them with his usual precision. "I'll record this tomorrow morning," Marcus said. "By Friday, it will be public record. Anyone who searches the title will see Veterans Rest listed as owner. Once that's done, Ethan can't challenge it. Not successfully. Not ever." Roy leaned back, feeling a steadiness he hadn't felt since the porch confrontation. "Then it's done." Marcus shook his head lightly. "Not quite. It will be done when the ink is dry in the clerk's office. But you've made the irreversible move, Roy. This is more than strategy. It's the end game." That night, Roy sat in his study with the paperwork copy on his desk, the house quiet around him. He stared at Helen's photo, the one with her hair lit copper by the lake sunset, and allowed himself the smallest smile. He hadn't surrendered. He hadn't been erased. He had changed the terms entirely. His phone buzzed on the table. Ethan's name lit the screen. He let it ring. Then a text appeared. "We're moving in Saturday. Don't try to stop it." Roy looked at the message, then at the neat folder of signed deeds. He whispered aloud, not in anger, but in certainty. "It's not mine to give you anymore." Friday morning arrived bright and cool. Marcus called before 9. "It's recorded," he said simply. "It's done." Roy closed his eyes, nodded once, and felt the truth of it settle. The villa was no longer a battlefield. It was a gift, a memorial, and a barrier all in one. Ethan's reach had ended, not with a shout, but with a signature. And that was exactly how Roy wanted it. The news didn't come with a bang. It arrived quietly, as so many irreversible things do. On Friday morning, the Veterans Rest Initiative posted a photograph on their social media. Their director, Dana Ortiz, stood on the villa's porch with the lake glinting behind her. In her hands was a plaque, temporary but symbolic. The caption read, "We are beyond grateful to accept the generous donation of the Clearview Lake Villa from Mr. Roy Hayes. This home will serve as a sanctuary for veterans and their families for decades to come." Within an hour, local outlets picked it up. By lunchtime, the photograph had been shared dozens of times. The lake house that had once been a point of humiliation now belonged to a cause larger than anyone's bitterness. Comments filled the feed. "What a gift. My brother could use a place like this. This is legacy." Roy sat in his study, the article open on his screen, sipping coffee that tasted different somehow. Stronger, cleaner. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. The house was safe, because it was no longer his to lose. His phone buzzed. The name on the screen didn't surprise him. He let it ring twice before answering. "Dad." Ethan's voice was brittle, stretched thin. "Is it true?" Roy kept his tone even. "If you mean the donation, yes. Veterans Rest owns the villa now. It's official, public record. You gave it away?" Ethan's words cracked like glass underfoot. "To strangers?" "Not strangers," Roy said quietly. "To people who will respect it. To people who will heal in it. I honored your mother." Silence swelled on the line. For a moment, Roy could almost hear Ethan's mind trying to reorganize the battlefield, searching for an angle that no longer existed. "You'd rather give it to them than your own son?" Ethan finally demanded. Roy closed his eyes, picturing Helen's face as it had looked on that porch, the sun turning her hair to fire. "I'd rather give it to people who understand what a home is," he said. "It's not leverage. It's not a trophy. And it's not yours to claim." Ethan's breath came hard through the line. "You've destroyed this family." "No," Roy answered softly. "You did that yourself. I just stopped pretending otherwise." The line went dead. Roy set the phone down without anger. The conversation had ended the only way it could, not in reconciliation, not in rage, but in the hollow quiet of a bridge already burned. That night, He didn't pour whiskey to steady himself. He didn't pace the halls of his house, replaying arguments or second-guessing decisions. Instead, he brushed his teeth, pulled the quilt over his shoulders, and lay back against the familiar weight of his pillow. Sleep came without a fight. Deep, unbroken, the kind of rest that had eluded him since Helen's passing. For years, he had lived as if his son's approval was the only measure of survival, bending until his spine ached under the weight of concessions. But the moment the deed transferred, that weight vanished. He had acted not from desperation, but from clarity. When he woke the next morning, sunlight pushed through the blinds in steady stripes. The house smelled of coffee and cedar polish. Outside, the neighborhood stirred like any other Saturday. But inside Roy Hayes, something had shifted permanently. He was no longer the man on the porch, smiling as his son tried to erase him. He was the man who had drawn a line with ink, who had turned grief into stewardship, who had placed memory where no betrayal could touch it. For the first time in years, Roy Hayes felt what peace actually was. The glass door clicked shut behind Roy, and for a moment the air inside Marcus Lee's conference room felt as taut as a stretched wire. Lemon polish lingered in the wood-paneled space, the scent almost sharp. At the far end of the long table, Marcus sat poised, his papers aligned into neat stacks. Across from him, Ethan, Madison, and her parents, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, sat bunched together as if proximity might increase their power. Ethan didn't greet his father. His jaw was locked, his eyes cold. Madison's arms were crossed, a shield of indifference, though the flush in her cheeks betrayed the tension underneath. Gerald looked stiff in his suit, as if dignity could be ironed into cloth, while Patricia's pearls quivered against her throat with each shallow breath. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice smooth and measured. "Thank you all for coming. Let's be clear at the outset. This is not a negotiation. This is an information session." "That's your opinion," Madison shot back, her manicured finger tapping the table. "No," Marcus replied evenly, sliding a packet toward the center of the table. "That's the law. And this," he tapped the top page, "is the record." The first sheet bore the county clerk's stamp, bold and unyielding. Gift deed, Clearview. Lake Villa transferred to Veterans Rest Initiative. Irrevocable charitable conveyance. The word irrevocable seemed to hang in the air, larger than the letters could contain. Patricia leaned forward, her voice tight. "You can't just give away family property. He's your son." Marcus adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Monroe, the property was solely titled in Mr. Hayes's name, purchased outright. In our statutes, there is no concept of familial entitlement beyond what is specified in wills or trusts. And Mr. Hayes has executed a lawful gift deed. It is, as I said, irrevocable." Gerald tried for diplomacy, his tone smooth as oiled hinges. "We don't want conflict. We only ask for fairness." "Richard," he caught himself, then stiffened at Roy's quiet stare. "Roy, surely you see how much sense it makes for us to stay there. You hardly use it." Roy's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I use it when I need to. And even if I didn't, it still wouldn't make it yours." Ethan's knuckles whitened against the table. "So you'd rather hand it over to strangers than your own blood? That's what this is about?" Roy didn't flinch. "It's about honoring your mother. Veterans Rest will use it as she would have wanted, a place for healing, not a battleground for entitlement." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Marcus slid another document across the table. "Here you'll find a notice of no trespass and a cease harassment warning. If any of you set foot on the property without Mr. Hayes's express invitation, an invitation tied to his donor access privilege, you will be in violation of criminal trespass statutes." Madison gave a brittle laugh. "Donor access? So he gives it away and keeps the keys? That's convenient. It's lawful. Marcus countered. The charity owns the property. Mr. Hayes has retained honorary lifetime access, revocable only by him. That is within the letter and spirit of the law. Patricia's face reddened. This is outrageous. No, Marcus said, folding his hands. This is binding. Ethan's voice broke through, low and tight. You've destroyed this family. Roy looked at his son, his tone steady. I enforced a boundary. Families survive boundaries. They die without them. For a moment, the Munros sat frozen. Then Marcus produced a final envelope. Mr. Hayes has arranged a relocation assistance grant through Veterans Rest. Vouchers for housing services. It won't buy you a lake view, but it will buy you time. Gerald's lips tightened. We don't want his charity. Roy met his eyes. You wanted it at the lake house. Patricia pushed the envelope back across the table with trembling fingers. Madison looked away. Ethan, however, stared at it for a long beat, then slid it back toward his parents without a word. No thanks, no refusal, just silence. The weight in the room shifted. Marcus gathered the remaining documents, stacking them with the precision of a man closing a case already won. The law is settled. Any further pressure will be met with remedies you cannot contest. I trust this ends here. Ethan sat back, his face pale. For the first time, his bravado cracked. His voice was quiet, almost childlike. Do you know what the worst part is? He looked at Roy, eyes burning. I keep hearing Mom telling me to be better, and it won't shut up. Roy's breath caught, but he said nothing. The silence pressed down until Ethan shoved his chair back, the scrape loud and final. Madison rose with him, her expression brittle. Gerald and Patricia followed, moving like people who had rehearsed dignity, but forgotten their lines. The door opened and closed behind them. When the room was empty, Marcus turned to Roy. You executed perfectly. Roy nodded once, voice low. Paper walls. They look thin until someone walks into them. The villa no longer hummed, with hidden wiring or waited with a predator's patience. The projectors were gone, boxed and returned to Darren with thanks. The directional audio modules, the backup batteries, the strobing lights, all stripped out until the house exhaled like a patient released from a fever. What remained was wood, stone, glass, and air. It was Helen's place again, not a machine designed to defend itself. Roy walked slowly through the rooms on the morning of the dedication, each step carrying memory. In the kitchen, sunlight stretched across the cedar counters he and Helen had sanded together. In the living room, the old quilt she had pieced still draped across the back of the couch, soft and familiar. The upstairs landing was silent, no silhouettes flickering, only the creak of the boards he knew by heart. The villa had shed its teeth and regained its voice, quiet, steady, forgiving. Outside, the lake shone with the same copper light Helen had always loved, a light that caught the ripples and turned them to hammered bronze. Roy paused on the porch, his hand resting on the railing he'd replaced last summer. His breath rose in the cool air, slow, deliberate. This was no longer a battleground. Today, it would become a sanctuary. Dana Ortiz met him at the door with a clipboard tucked under one arm. The director of Veterans Rest carried herself with a balance of efficiency and warmth. Her voice pitched low, respectful of what the day meant. Mr. Hayes, she said, extending her hand. Everything is ready. A small group will arrive this afternoon for the dedication. Board members, a few local veterans, no press beyond the town paper. We wanted to keep it simple, the way you asked. Roy shook her hand, firm but measured. That's how Helen would have wanted it. No spectacle, just a house doing what a house should. Dana smiled at that, then reached into her folder and withdrew a slim sheet of paper. There's one more thing, she said. Our board approved a plaque. We'd like your permission before we install it. Roy unfolded the page. The design was simple, a brushed bronze plate mounted on cedar. The inscription read, "Given in memory of Helen Hayes. May this house be a quiet kind of healing." The words landed with the weight of truth. Roy traced them with his thumb, imagining them affixed by the porch, the first thing visitors would see. Helen's name, not as a possession, not as a relic of grief, but as a promise. She hated noise, Roy murmured. Even the wrong kind of laughter could unsettle her. But she loved stillness. She believed in it. Dana tilted her head. "So, do we have your blessing?" Roy folded the paper carefully, as if it might tear under careless hands. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low but certain. "Set it there. Let her name keep watch." Together they walked the property, Dana asking small questions. Where the morning light came in strongest, which room Helen used as her sewing space, how the fireplace drew best when the wind shifted. Roy answered steadily, offering details like a steward passing on sacred knowledge. When they reached the dock, Dana stopped, taking in the spread of water and the sweep of pines. "It feels like it's waiting," she said softly. "It is," Roy replied, "waiting for the right kind of footsteps, not the ones that come to take, but the ones that come to rest." Later that afternoon, when the first cars crunched along the gravel, Roy stood to the side watching. Veterans stepped out slowly, some with canes, some with children, their faces carrying the lines of things endured and survived. They looked at the villa with curiosity, not entitlement. A few even paused to breathe the air before walking closer. Dana greeted them, her voice calm and welcoming. No speeches, no fanfare, just a gentle ushering inside. Roy stayed on the porch, hands in his pockets, listening to the rhythm of boots and laughter and the shifting murmur of voices that belonged here now. The house had changed its purpose. It no longer needed to defend against intruders. It needed only to open itself to healing. When the group had gone inside, Dana returned to Roy's side. "We'll place the plaque tomorrow," she said, quietly, at dawn. "No ceremony, just the house and the lake." Roy looked out over the water, the light thinning into silver. "That's enough," he said. They stood together in silence as evening gathered, the villa behind them steady and unburdened, the lake ahead reflecting the sky's slow retreat. Roy's heart, for the first time in years, matched the rhythm of the place. Calm, resolute, quiet. The snow had thinned by morning, leaving a crust of white along the pines and a sheen of glassy frost on the dock. Roy sat on the porch with his coffee, the villa behind him restored to calm. The dedication had passed quietly, the plaque waiting to be mounted, Helen's name etched in bronze. The house felt ready to serve its new purpose. He was still watching the lake when tires crunched against the gravel. A truck pulled in, older model, its paint dulled by years but steady in its sound. A man climbed out, tall and broad-shouldered, jacket frayed at the cuffs, hair threaded with gray. He hesitated only a moment before walking toward the porch. "You Hayes?" he called. "I am," Roy answered, standing. The man extended a hand. "Ray Torres, served with a guy named Price. He mentioned this place, said it might be open to men like us. I figured I'd see it for myself before the crowd comes." Roy shook his hand, noting the firmness in the grip, the weary posture behind it. "You came a long way?" 2 hours. Close enough when a man tells you there's somewhere worth breathing." Ray glanced toward the lake. His eyes narrowed, as if he were measuring depth. "You ever notice how still water fools you? Looks harmless, flat, safe. But it's deep, strong. It can hold you if you respect it, or drown you if you forget." Roy followed his gaze. "Yes." I've noticed Ray's silence lingered before he spoke again. "Heard you lost someone here." His tone wasn't prying, more like a man naming what was already known. "Not here," Roy said quietly. "But this was hers." And after she was gone, People I trusted tried to make it theirs. Ray nodded slowly. That's how it works sometimes. When you've got something whole, someone will try to carve a piece. Doesn't matter what it costs you. Roy leaned against the railing. And yet, you keep what matters. Or you turn it into something that outlasts the grasping hands Ray's jaw flexed. He didn't press further. Instead, he let the lake hold the silence until he spoke again. We won't waste it, he said simply. Men like me, we know what it means when someone gives instead of takes. You'll never have to wonder if it mattered. The words struck deeper than Roy expected. Not gratitude dressed up in politeness, not ceremony. Just truth, plain and solid as the boards under their feet. Roy looked at him, then back at the villa, the house Helen had poured her care into, the house he had almost lost to betrayal. That's all I ask, he said. Don't waste it. Let it heal. Ray's eyes softened. Then we'll do right by her. By you. They stood side by side for a time, neither speaking, watching the still water ripple under the push of a cold breeze. Roy thought of Helen's laughter, of the nights on this porch when her hand rested in his. He thought of Ethan, of the years bent by silence and entitlement, of boundaries that had come too late but had finally held. Ray adjusted his jacket and stepped back toward the truck. I'll be back with others. Thought you should know? You've given more than a house. You've given a chance. Roy inclined his head. Safe travels. When the truck pulled away, the gravel noise faded until only the wind and the lap of water remained. Roy returned to the porch chair, coffee cooling in his hands. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet Helen had cherished, a quiet note of emptiness, but of promise. The first snow came early that year, drifting across the lake in a hush that felt older than the pines themselves. Roy had driven up the day before with a thermos and a box of photographs, intending only to sit with the silence. The villa no longer hummed with the hidden machinery Darren had rigged, no longer held the tension of intrusion. It was quiet now, and the snow added another layer of calm. He sat on the porch with his coffee, bundled in a coat Helen had bought him years back, watching the flakes collect along the railing. The lake looked different under winter's hand, steel instead of glass, depth instead of shimmer. Roy found himself breathing easier, as if the cold air carried something out of him with every exhale. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. He frowned, setting his mug aside. Few visitors came here unannounced now. When the vehicle came into view, recognition hit before the engine even shut off. Ethan's SUV, streaked with salt and mud, rolled to a stop near the steps. The door opened slowly. Ethan climbed out, shoulders hunched against the wind, a cardboard carrier of coffee balanced in one hand. No Madison trailing behind him, no parents-in-law playing at ownership. Just Ethan, alone, looking older than the last time Roy had seen him. "Morning, Dad," he said, his breath visible in the chill. Roy didn't move from his chair. "You drove fast." Ethan came up the steps, holding out one of the cups. "Brought coffee. Don't know if you still drink it this late in the day." Roy accepted it, but didn't sip. "Depends on the company." For a long moment, the only sound was the snow tapping softly against the wood. Ethan shifted, his boots creaking on the porch. "I'm not here to fight," he said, "and I'm not here to ask for the house back." "I know that's done." Roy studied him. The younger man's face carried a rawness, as though sleep had been scarce and pride had been forced down to make room for something else. "I left Madison," Ethan went on quietly. "For now, at least." We were circling the same argument, and I realized I didn't want to live inside anger every day. She called it leaving. I called it breathing. Roy finally took a sip of the coffee. Bitter, hot, grounding. "And what do you call this visit?" Ethan drew a breath that looked heavier than the snow itself. "An apology." Not the kind where I ask you for something in return, just the kind where I admit I was wrong." The words hung in the cold air, honest and unpolished. Roy felt a part of him stiffen, the part that had waited too long for this, and another part soften, the part that had once believed it would never come. "You said once that family dies without boundaries," Ethan continued. "I didn't understand that then. I thought saying yes was love, and saying no was betrayal. Turns out, it's the other way around." Roy leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "If you want time here, you'll speak with Dana. It's her schedule now, not mine." Ethan nodded without protest. "That's fair. No fanfare, no declarations of rebuilding, just agreement." A bridge set quietly back in place, plank by plank. They sat together for a while, watching the flakes drift heavier, the lake slowly vanishing under a veil of white. Ethan sipped his coffee in silence, his posture no longer combative, no longer carrying the weight of entitlement. Roy thought of Helen then, how she would have scolded him for holding on to bitterness too long, how she would have smiled at this scene, two men finally sharing the same cold porch without breaking it with raised voices. The fire inside the villa crackled faintly through the windows. Dana had left notes for upcoming groups, her handwriting neat, her words practical. The house had its mission now. Roy had his boundaries. Ethan had taken his first step toward something better. Snow gathered on the roof, thickening in the gutters, softening every edge of the villa. Roy lifted his mug again, the steam warming his face. "Coffee's decent," he said finally. Ethan gave a small, almost startled laugh. "Better than decent. At least, that's what I told myself on the drive." Roy allowed himself the faintest smile. "Well, then it's a start." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't waiting to break. It was the kind of silence a father and son could share when words weren't the only measure of distance anymore. When Ethan finally stood, brushing snow from his coat, he didn't make promises. He didn't say he'd be back soon or that things would be different now. He simply said, "Thanks for the coffee." Roy nodded once. Safe drive. The SUV rolled away, its taillights fading against the curtain of white. Roy stayed on the porch, sipping the last of his coffee, the snow still falling steady. It wasn't reconciliation in the storybook sense. It was something quieter, sturdier, a different kind of apology, met with a different kind of acceptance. And for Roy, it was enough. The snow hadn't lifted when the vans finally turned onto the drive. Roy had been standing at the window, watching the lake vanish into mist, when he heard the muffled crunch of tires. He stepped out onto the porch as the first door slid open. Boots hit the snow one after another. Men and women climbed down carefully, some carrying duffels, others helping children balance on the icy gravel. Their laughter was small at first, tentative, the kind of laughter people make when they aren't sure yet if they've reached safety. Dana was there, clipboard tucked under her arm, voice calm and steady as she welcomed each family. A boy, no more than 12, slipped on the porch step. His father caught him by the arm, and they both laughed, real this time, before moving inside. Behind them, a woman pulled her scarf tighter, then stopped just under the eaves, looking at the house as though she could feel its history pressing out through the walls. Roy stayed back. This wasn't his moment to command or to explain. It was theirs, to see the villa not as a battlefield, but as shelter. He let himself watch, though, as Dana guided them to the fire that had been lit hours earlier. The smoke curled up the chimney, carrying warmth into the frozen air. Inside, through the windows, Roy caught glimpses of movement. Coats shrugged off, gloves stacked near the door, the tentative glow of faces catching firelight. Then came sound, the soft rustle of settling, the scrape of chairs, and finally, the low rumble of conversation, building like water, finding its flow again. The house had been holding its breath for too long. Now it exhaled. Roy leaned against the porch post, letting the snow land on his shoulders. This was what Helen had wanted, though she'd never said it in such words. A house that gave more than it took, a place where grief could dissolve just enough to make room for laughter. He thought back to the months when each creak in the floorboards had sounded like threat, when silence meant something was about to break. That silence was gone now. In its place was life, fragile but real. A child's laugh cut through the night, clear and unburdened. The sound startled Roy, not because it was loud, but because it was so free. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that kind of sound in these rooms. The porch light hummed softly, snow piling higher against the posts. Roy stayed where he was, mug cooling in his hands, watching the house do what it was meant to do. Hold the living, hold the weary, hold the broken, until they found themselves steady again. The villa was no longer a possession to fight over. It was a vessel, and tonight it was finally full. The villa stood quiet again by the time Roy returned to the porch. The families inside had settled for the night, their laughter replaced by the softer rhythms of rest. He looked out over the lake, the surface a sheet of steel beneath the snow-filled sky, and let his thoughts settle. It struck him that for most of his life he had misunderstood what it meant to love. He had assumed it meant filling every gap, smoothing every conflict, and offering up pieces of himself to cover the holes left in others. That was why Ethan's demands had once broken him so easily, because he thought a father's role was to give, even when nothing was left. But grief had taught him differently. Love wasn't surrender. It wasn't handing over the keys to his own soul because someone else couldn't bear the weight of their own emptiness. He thought of the phrase Marcus once used: paper walls, legal filings, deeds, letters, notices. They looked flimsy from a distance, almost laughable compared to the storms of anger and guilt that had battered him. But when those storms hit, the paper walls had held. They didn't need to be steel. They only needed to be firm, unmoved, written in ink that couldn't be scrubbed away. That was what boundaries were. They weren't war. They were structure. And structure gave life a shape that chaos couldn't bend. Roy breathed in the cold air and let it sting. His son might never fully understand, but that no longer had to undo him. Ethan would have his own road to walk, his own reckonings to face. Roy's task was simpler and harder at the same time: to remain steady, to keep what was his, and to give only when giving didn't mean erasing himself. He looked back through the window, where the fire still glowed faintly against the walls. The veterans and their families weren't his to save either. They had brought their own scars, their own burdens, but the house was giving them what it had given him: room to breathe. That was enough. Turning back to the lake, Roy felt a small surge of gratitude, not only for the house or for the plaque that bore Helen's name, but for the simple truth that he had finally learned to live by. Boundaries weren't weapons. They were the lines that kept love honest. And to anyone listening, he wanted to say this: grief can make you believe that silence is safety, that surrender is love, that giving everything will bring someone back to you. But none of that is true. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to say no, and to mean it. He let the night close in, steady as a locked door, and whispered the words he'd come to trust. Not war, not surrender, just enough. If your own child looked you in the eye and demanded something that wasn't theirs, how would you respond? Would you hand it over for the sake of peace, or would you draw the line, even if it meant losing them for a while? These are the moments that test not only family bonds, but also our ability to protect what truly matters. I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share what you would have done in Roy's place. Do you think he was too firm or not firm enough? Would you have chosen a different path? Your perspective could give someone else the clarity they need in their own struggle. And while you're here, Don't forget to like this video if the story struck a chord and subscribe to the channel for more powerful journeys of betrayal, boundaries, and unexpected justice. When you subscribe and turn on notifications, you'll never miss the moment when the quiet becomes a roar. Stay tuned, because the next story begins with a line that chills deeper than snow. The day a will was rewritten behind my back until a stranger knocked.